Grace had become very good at moving through ordinary days. She knew how to answer emails with a calm voice. She knew how to smile at neighbors in the hallway, how to ask people how they were doing, how to fold grief into the corners of a morning so it would not spill everywhere. She knew how to keep going because life had required it from her long before she felt ready. But May still found her. Every year it arrived softly at first. A few flowers outside the grocery store, cards with pastel colors, advertisements reminding people to celebrate their mothers, strangers carrying bouquets on the street. None of it was cruel on purpose, but it touched a place in Grace that still felt tender. Her mother had been gone for 2 years. 2 years was long enough for people to stop asking how Grace was doing, long enough for the world to assume that grief had organized itself into something manageable. And in some ways, it had. Grace no longer cried every morning. She no longer reached for the phone before remembering. She no longer stood in the kitchen, waiting for a voice that would not come from the other room. But grief had not disappeared. It had simply changed its address. Now it lived in the small things. The smell of cinnamon, the quiet after dinner, the way sunlight fell across the kitchen table in the late afternoon. It lived in the pause before Mother's Day, in the ache of wanting to buy a card and having nowhere to send it. Grace worked at a small community library in a town where people still returned books late with handwritten apologies tucked inside them. The library was not grand, but it was warm. Old wooden shelves, soft carpet, a children's corner with faded cushions, a front desk that had seen decades of ordinary human stories pass over it. That Tuesday, Grace was sorting returned books when Nora came in, carrying a brown paper bag. Nora was one of the volunteers. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair, kind eyes, and a way of noticing people that made them feel less invisible. She never asked too many questions. She simply paid attention. She placed the bag gently on the counter. "For you," she said. Grace looked up. "What is it?" Nora smiled, but there was something careful in her expression. "Open it when you get home." Grace touched the folded top of the bag. It was warm, just slightly, as if whatever was inside had been held close. "Nora." "It's nothing fancy," Nora said. "Just something I thought might find you." Grace did not understand what that meant until later. She carried the bag home on the passenger seat beside her. The whole drive she felt strangely aware of it, as if a quiet animal were sleeping there. She did not peek. Something about Nora's voice had made her want to wait. At home, Grace placed the bag on the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet. Evening light came through the window in a pale gold strip, touching the chair where her mother used to sit during visits. Grace noticed that chair often in May. She noticed it the way one notices an old scar, not with surprise, but with recognition. She opened the bag. Inside was a small glass jar wrapped in a clean cotton cloth and tied with string. Apple butter. Grace stared at it. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe in the normal way. Her mother used to make apple butter every fall. Not often, not for everyone. It was one of those quiet rituals that belonged to their home. Apples simmering for hours, cinnamon, cloves, brown sugar, and patience. A wooden spoon moving slowly through a pot until the whole house smelled like warmth. Grace had mentioned it once. She remembered now. It had been months ago, during a slow afternoon at the library. Nora had been labeling donated books, and Grace had said something about how the smell of cinnamon always made her think of her mother's kitchen. She had said it casually, almost without thinking. A passing sentence, a small piece of memory that she had not expected anyone to keep. But Nora had kept it. Grace sat down before opening the jar. There are moments when the heart understands before the mind catches up. This was one of them. The gift was not just apple butter. It was memory made tangible. It was someone saying, without saying it, "I heard you. I remember what matters to you. I know this month is not simple." She unscrewed the lid. The scent rose slowly, warm and deep. Apples cooked down into sweetness, cinnamon, a trace of cloves, something earthy and familiar. And suddenly, Grace was no longer only in her kitchen. She was also 8 years old, standing on a stool beside her mother, watching steam fog the window. She was 15, coming home from school to a house that smelled like autumn. She was 32, visiting for the weekend, pretending not to cry when her mother sent her home with a jar wrapped in a dish towel. Her mother's hands came back to her first. Not her face, not her voice, her hands. Hands that peeled apples without rushing. Hands that wiped counters, buttoned coats, touched foreheads to check for fever. Hands that seemed ordinary when Grace was young, because children often do not know that ordinary love is still love. She took a spoon from the drawer. The first taste was not exactly the same as her mother's. Of course it wasn't. Nothing made by another pair of hands could return the past perfectly. That it reached the same place, that was what surprised her. It reached the place where love is stored after a person is gone. Not in a clear memory, not in a photograph, not even in words, but somewhere deeper, somewhere the body remembers before the mind can explain. Grace leaned forward and covered her mouth with her hand. She cried quietly. Not the kind of crying that asks to be rescued, the kind that comes when something true finally has permission to be felt. She cried because she missed her mother. She cried because Nora had remembered.
She cried because a jar on a kitchen table had become a doorway.
And for a few minutes, Grace felt less alone inside her own grief. After a while, she pulled her old journal from a drawer. She had not written in it for weeks, maybe months. She opened to a blank page and wrote, "Today I understood that love does not only stay in the person who gave it. It travels. It hides inside recipes, in the attention of friends, in the scent of something warm on a quiet evening. Mom is not here in the way I want her to be, but something she gave me is still moving through the world, still finding ways to reach me." She read the sentence twice. Then she added, "Maybe grief hurts so much because love is still alive inside it." The next morning, Grace brought the empty brown paper bag back to the library, folded carefully. Nora was watering a small plant near the front window. Grace stood beside her for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said. Nora looked at her with the softness of someone who already knew. "Did it taste all right?" Grace smiled through tears she did not bother hiding. "It tasted like being remembered." Nora's eyes grew bright. "I'm glad." Grace wanted to say more. She wanted to explain the kitchen, the chair, the smell, the way her mother's hands had appeared in her mind so clearly that it almost hurt. But Nora did not need a full explanation. Some people understand the strengths of a feeling without needing every detail. So Grace simply said, "She used to make it in the fall." "I know," Nora said gently. "You told me." That was the part that stayed with Grace all day. "You told me." Such a simple phrase, but inside it was a kind of tenderness. Nora had not fixed anything. She had not tried to make grief smaller. She had not offered advice or told Grace that her mother was in a better place or that time would heal everything. She had only listened to a small memory and honored it. Grace began to understand that attention is one of the quietest forms of love. For the next week, she ate the apple butter slowly, a little on toast before work, a spoonful with tea at night. Once, on a rainy afternoon, she spread it over a warm biscuit and sat by the window without turning on the television. She let the silence be full instead of empty. Each time, a different memory came. Her mother humming in the kitchen, her mother wiping flour from her cheek with the back of her wrist, her mother saying, "Don't rush sweetness, it needs time." Grace had forgotten that phrase until the apple butter brought it back. It made her think about grief differently. Maybe healing was not about rushing the pain away. Maybe healing was letting sweetness and sorrow sit at the same table until they stopped being enemies. Maybe the heart did not need to choose between missing someone and feeling grateful that they had lived. One Sunday evening, Grace called her younger brother. They did not usually talk about their mother for very long, not because they didn't want to, but because both of them were afraid of where the conversation might lead. That night, Grace told him about the jar. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I can smell it just from you saying it." Grace laughed softly, and then they both cried a little. They talked for almost an hour about apple butter, about the old kitchen, about the time their mother burned the first batch and insisted it was still perfectly useful, about the way she always saved the smallest jar for herself, but somehow never ate it because she kept giving it away. When they hung up, Grace realized something had shifted. The grief was still there, but now it had company. The jar lasted 9 days. On the last morning, Grace stood at the counter with a piece of toast and the final spoonful. She thought it would make her sad to finish it, and it did, a little. But there was something else too, a quiet sense of completion. The jar was empty because she had received the gift, not hidden it away to protect herself from the ending, not saved it until it lost its meaning. She had let it nourish her. She had allowed the love to arrive, spoon by spoon, morning by morning. She washed the jar carefully. Then she placed it on the windowsill. For a while, it held nothing. Then, a week later, Grace put a few small wildflowers inside it, yellow ones she had picked near the library parking lot. They were not perfect flowers. Their stems leaned in different directions. One petal was already bent, but in the little glass jar, they looked exactly right. May did not become easy after that. Grace did not expect it to. Mother's Day still came with its ache. Certain songs still caught her off guard. There were still evenings when she missed her mother with a force that made the room feel too quiet. But she no longer believed that sadness meant love had failed to leave. She began to believe the opposite. Sadness was evidence that love had stayed. And love, real love, does not always stay in the form we choose. Sometimes it becomes a recipe. Sometimes it becomes a friend who remembers. Sometimes it becomes a scent rising from a jar in a quiet kitchen. Sometimes it becomes the courage to say someone's name again. Grace still misses her mother. She always will. But now, when the ache rises, she tries not to push it away too quickly. She lets it sit beside her. She lets it bring what it came carrying. Because sometimes grief brings pain, yes, but sometimes it brings proof. Proof that someone loved us in ways so steady, so ordinary, so woven into the fabric of our days that even after they leave, we keep finding them. In gestures, in flavors, in the hands of other people, in the parts of ourselves that learned how to love because they loved us first. True love never really leaves. It changes form. It finds another road. It arrives quietly, carrying cinnamon and memory, and sits down at the kitchen table as if it has known the way home all along. If something here touched you, keep it gently. It was meant for you.